Yes, just yes.
Well, there. How about that, Anneliese? Welcome.
So remember, we are.
Well done.
The timing is perfection.
We are
Anneliese.
live streaming in a second.
Live?
Yes.
Okay. And Anneliese, I think you can. Well, you can stay mute as long as you unmute when you're ready to speak.
Okay.
Okay. Right.
We are live streaming, so you can broadcast. Shall I start the meeting? Yeah.
Go for it, Freddie.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on fairer taxation for a fairer economic recovery. I'm Hamish Sanderson, and I'm the chair of Labour Business. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome so many of our members and so many members of the wider business community to this webinar. A big thank you to all of you for taking time to attend. And a big thank you to Social Enterprise UK, who have helped us to put this event together. For those of you who don't know Labour Business, I should explain that we are the oldest, largest, and only business membership organisation affiliated to the Labour Party. Affiliated to the party, yes, but independent of it, which gives us a certain influence, but also a certain freedom to fly kites. We may see one of those tonight. Labour Business was founded by Harold Wilson, no less, in 1972 to enable the Labour Party to have a conversation with the business community on the basis that if we don't listen to business, we really can't expect business to listen to us. And at a time of unprecedented upheaval, that conversation has never, in my view, been more important. What Harold Wilson started doing in 1972, we're still doing today, now more than ever, listening to businesses, small, medium, and large, up and down the country, through roundtables, forums, and events. Sadly, these are now entirely online for the time being, but that has its advantages if you live in Cornwall, like some of today's participants. Through our business engagement events, we collect evidence to feed into the party's policy development process, working closely with Keir Starmer's new leadership team, with MPs and peers, with mayors and councillors, helping to develop evidence-based policies that are road-tested and deliverable on the ground. We are also represented within the party's formal policy-making structure, the NPF, or National Policy Forum. In fact, a written record of this event is being made by one of the party's policy officers and will be submitted to the NPF's current consultation. So, be in no doubt, today's event is not a chat fest for the sake of it, a conversation with a purpose, to help Labour hold the government to account while we are in opposition, and to develop a policy programme for Labour in government after the next general election. Let me turn now to our subject matter for today. It's undeniable that we face at least three major crises: a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis. Our view in Labour Business is that businesses, good businesses, must be part of the solution to these multiple crises. And when I say good businesses, I mean that there must be no return to a business as usual economy that has failed. We need a partnership of government, businesses, workers, and their trade unions working together to redesign a more resilient, more sustainable, and yes, fairer economic model if we are to build our way back to economic recovery. One element of this building back better, this redesign effort, is a fairer tax system, and that's what we're going to be debating today. And to be clear, we're not just talking about taxation as a way of raising revenue for public services, important though that is. We're not just talking about taxation as a way of redistributing wealth, important though that is. We're also talking about taxation as a tool of progressive social change, a wider agenda of tax reform to incentivize better business practices and to create a greener economy and to lay the foundations for a fairer society. It's a big debate that the Labour Party needs to have with the business community, with its workforce, and with the trade union movement. That debate starts here today. To launch the debate, we are joined by an absolutely brilliant panel. We have Labour's Shadow Chancellor, Anneliese Dodds. We have Labour's Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Dan Carden. And we have 3 experts on the role of tax as a tool of progressive social change. These are Andrew O'Brien from Social Enterprise UK, Sarah Arnold from the New Economics Foundation, and Robert Palmer from Tax Justice UK. To round off the proceedings, promptly at 7:15, we have Liz Minns, Vice Chair of the Labour Business Economic Policy Group. Here's the format. I will ask the Shadow Chancellor to speak first, then our 3 experts, then the Shadow Financial Secretary. We will then have the Q&A. I've already received some questions in advance, but you can also put your questions during the webinar, either to the panel as a whole or to an individual panelist. To put a question, please use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you just want to make a comment, you can use the chat button, but I won't ask the panel to respond to it. I will do my utmost to take as many questions for the panel as possible, so please make them brief. I turn now to the star of the show. Anneliese Dodds was elected as the MP for Oxford East in 2017. Before that, she had been an MEP since 2014. Following her election to Westminster, she has had a meteoric rise, serving as Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury and John McDonnell's Treasury team, and being appointed as Shadow Chancellor by Keir Starmer in April of this year. Anneliese has been a long-standing friend of Labour business since becoming an MP. She's worked closely with us on business engagement and policy development. So we were absolutely delighted when she was appointed to the top economic job in the Shadow Cabinet. Anneliese, I suppose it would be an understatement to say you've had a busy week at the office. So we are enormously grateful to you for making the time to join us tonight. Comrades, friends, colleagues, Anneliese Dodds, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Over to you, Anneliese.
Well, thank you ever so much, Hamish. That was such a lovely introduction. I can feel myself reddening because of that. I must say the only way is now down. So apologies if that happens. But it's really great to be part of this discussion and with Labour Business in particular, who do such fantastic work, but also Social Enterprise UK, Tax Justice, campaigners as well, NEF, and of course all of you members who are engaged in this. And it's terrific to have Dan, who's a really fantastic member of my Shadow Treasury team, also with us as well. I've probably missed out somebody. There's so many terrific people with us tonight. I don't want to indulge in a chat fest, to use Hamish's words, so I'm not going to go on for too long, but I suppose I just wanted to try and start the discussion a little bit with a few reflections. Now, obviously, as you all know, Labour is likely to be, unfortunately, 4 years away from the next general election. So we have a lot of time, probably. We have a lot of time to think through some really fundamental questions about our tax system and whether it's really delivering. And I suppose the first thing I would say is that, you know, we're in a situation where, unfortunately, you know, for Labour parties, it's often harder to talk about tax than for right-wing parties. You know, whenever you say that you want the system to be a more progressive one, immediately you get nonsense like, oh, you know, you're going to kind of want to tax people's back gardens and all this kinds of nonsense. So we need to be taking this back to first principles, I think, thinking through all of the options and using your ideas to build up to a really, really strong manifesto in tax terms when we come to the time of the next election. I suppose I'd also want to say that, you know, it's really great this discussion's happening now, because so often tax is just forgotten in the policy debates. You know, very often changes to tax are looked at, particularly reductions in tax, as if they're completely costless. But of course, we know that they're not. I mean, we've just seen the announcements around stamp duty, for example, stamp duty holiday. Of course, the problem is once you announce or you leak, as happened recently, that you're going to be cutting stamp duty, it's very difficult to then not go ahead with it, because then it creates that incentive for people not to try to sell their homes. But actually, if we were looking at this from first principles, wouldn't we have wanted to have more targeted measures which could support genuinely affordable homes, social homes, rather than that very, very broad change, which often, as we know, is just being passed on to those who are selling homes rather than those who are buying them in the first place. So we need to really have that well-informed discussion about tax. So it's so good that we're doing that. I suppose three kind of critical questions I think we need to be looking into. You know, first of all, they are those big distributional questions. I mean, we know, I've been looking at the statistics from the ONS. The latest statistics I've been able to find indicate that even just when you're looking at income, so when you're not taking on board people's assets, that actually the very worst off 10% of people in the UK see more of a proportion of their income going into taxation than the top 10%. Now, we need to be getting beyond, I think, often the public perception that we've still got a very progressive tax system. We haven't anymore in the UK. You know, what can we do to generate understanding around this? You think about a tax like, for example, inheritance tax. Only 4% of estates pay inheritance tax, and yet huge numbers of people think that it's going to be something that they or their family would face, although really it's not applying to huge numbers of people. And in fact, there are a number of people on this call who've done brilliant work in showing the many loopholes that mean that many of the very best off people don't end up, or their estates don't end up paying that tax in the first place. I think we need to look at other distributional questions as well. Of course, people will recall maybe some of those discussions we had around corporation tax reductions, where we were saying to government, well, actually, you look at the unequal ownership of companies and of capital in the UK in terms of company ownership, share ownership, etc. You know, these are measures that are likely to be benefiting men more than they are women. You start to have that conversation, and unfortunately, those on the right say, oh, this has got nothing to do with the relationship between men and women, but it does have that distributional impact. So how can we focus in on some of those distributional questions? Second area that I think we do need to be looking at is around tax reliefs. And actually, Hamish was talking about how we can use taxation to incentivize certain behaviours. But of course, we've got a whole plethora of tax reliefs which are meant to do that, but which receive very little scrutiny. You know, other countries often publish schedules of their tax reliefs with the costs of those tax reliefs published alongside their budget. We don't do that in the UK. We don't have much scrutiny of them. As I said, they're often presented as relatively costless, but they're really not. You know, that is foregone expenditure, potentially, that could have been directed in a more targeted way to support different aspects of social justice that we might want to see put into action. I know Dan's been doing a lot of brilliant work on that, Dan Carden. And then finally, of course, there's the big issues around tax avoidance and evasion, where we've seen, you know, a lot of heat, I would say, over certainly the last 10 years, not necessarily so much light, you know, really big international questions where I think the UK should be taking a much stronger position. You know, we seem to have, to an extent, a division of view between the US and EU over how you tax intangibles. We need to break through that division. We need to get this sorted out, because there's far too much so-called profit shifting going on with very major companies just not paying the tax that they should be. Of course, we all know the impacts of that is that businesses on our high streets then are still having to pay tax, business rates, etc., and they're at an unfair disadvantage. Can we, for example, get the Office for Tax Simplification to look at this and stop having to just give recommendations that are revenue neutral? Surely they should be allowed to be saying we can actually capture more revenue for the public purse through sensible changes. And then just finally, what do we need to do in order to make sure that our tax services have got the right resources to be clamping down on tax avoidance and evasion? Now, again, Dan's been doing a lot of really good work on this. We've seen HMRC's headcount go down massively. They're in the middle of a big restructuring programme. And yet, very often, you know, when I've talked to individual HMRC officials, they want to be making sure that we get those resources in that we really need. And I've had, you know, a number of former HMRC officials saying to me how angry they are that, for example, they've put forward proposals sometimes to stop tax avoidance. They get watered down through the consultation process. It's often captured by particular interests, and then we don't see the right measures being put into place and enforced. So a lot to talk about, a lot that we need to sort out before the next manifesto, but, you know, it'd be really great to hear people's thoughts around that. And thanks very much to everyone who's participating in this event.
And thank you, Anneliese. That was a brilliant analysis of the the issues that we're going to debate. And yes, indeed, we have already had questions on all of those three things: the distribution or redistribution question, the incentives for better behaviors, penalties for not such good behaviors, and of course the whole question of avoidance and the fairness or lack of fairness in the way in which revenues are collected. So it's all there on the table, and it's a very good time to start discussing this set of issues as we start with a new Labour leadership, a new energy around the party in relation to business engagement and policy development. So I'll turn next to our first expert. Andrew O'Brien is the Director of External Affairs at Social Enterprise UK. A particular thank you to Andrew for really giving us a lot of impetus to the design of this debate, because we could have covered a whole range of macroeconomic issues, but we thought that focusing on taxation as he puts it in his subtitle, tax as a lever for change, shaping a more socially and environmentally responsible economy. And that's what this is all about. Not to neglect the other aspects of tax, but nonetheless, that's the creative side that we need to look at and get some bright new ideas. And Andrew's the man for that. So Andrew, you're on.
Thank you, Hamish. And I feel like you've made me responsible for everybody giving up their Thursday evening as well. So sorry for that. And I'd also like to say a big shout out to the Social Enterprise UK members, which I know are on this as well. And I can see a few of you in the attendees list. So thank you very much for that. And like Hamish, I appreciate the Shadow Chancellor giving up her time. She's been a great champion of social enterprise, taking particular interest in the social investment tax relief and many other issues. So we're very grateful to you, and hopefully we can continue to work with you in your new enlarged brief, of which we are now perhaps a slightly smaller part, but hopefully still an important one. There are just a few points I wanted to make this evening, really, and as Hamish said, I put forward this idea around tax. Firstly, because I think, as Anneliese said, first of all, Labour does often seem to be on the back foot when it comes to tax issues, and I'm not sure why that necessarily is. It shouldn't be, and I think actually there's a lot of potential ground for the Labour Party to make on tax issues. I think people recognise that there is something wrong with our tax system. It's not generating the outcomes that we expect it to, but also it lacks any kind of values base or plan. I mean, Anneliese mentioned the stamp duty cut. I mean, stamp duty was first, I think, proposed in the late 1690s, and yet we're still using it to generate huge amounts of revenue, even though the economy has moved on hugely since that time. And I think it just goes to show that what we have essentially in this country is a tax system which is designed purely from a revenue raising perspective, rather than from a what's the implication on society? What is that distributional impact, as Anneliese said? What is the kind of vision for the future that we want to create? The Treasury tends to look at tax as if it's a kind of a snapshot of the economy as we have now, and just trying to raise revenue from that, rather than where are we going in the future. And I think there's an opportunity for Labour really to highlight that, and to paint a picture, I suppose, for the public about what kind of economy they want to build and how tax can help to deliver that. And so I suppose my plea, my key message from this evening is, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, A, because you've all joined this webinar, but B, I know Anneliese's particular interest in tax issues, that, you know, Labour needs to come up with a plan and a vision for how the tax system can deliver a fairer recovery, and not just purely talk about it in terms of the revenue raising side, although that is critically important. And I think actually the benefit from that would put pressure on this government to respond. It would, I think, make business, I think, feel a bit more comfortable about talking about some of these issues as well, if they felt like there was an opposition which was engaged in it. So I think there's a huge range of benefits to the economy in the country. I mean, my second point is just to try and talk about the scale of what we're discussing here this evening, because again, a lot of focus is given on the kind of the spending side of the state, and particularly at the moment, given the large amount of borrowing that the UK government is doing. But we're raising £900 billion in tax roughly every year. As Anneliese said as well, we have another 1,000 tax reliefs at least, which are foregoing around £400 billion of revenue. So already got 1.5 trillion or so pounds going through the system, or not going through the system. And then finally, of course, and I think the fantastic work that Tax Justice UK has done, and others, to highlight revenue foregone. I mean, I think the estimate is anywhere between 50 to 100 billion pounds a year worth of tax being lost in the UK, and probably hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars around the rest of the world. So, you know, tax is a critical lever in this process. And I think sometimes when we think of tax release, we think about it in terms of these micro initiatives which government does, you know, a tweak to a relief here or a giveaway over there. And often when you read the Red Book and the Treasury, they're kind of in the tens of millions of pounds. But as Anneliese said, on the aggregate, these are really shaping our entire economy and activities that business do. And there are many businesses out there which would be pursuing much more productive and more useful investments if the tax environment was conducive to doing that. I think particularly when we talk about decarbonisation and climate change, and perhaps Neff might want to talk to that in a bit more detail. But you know, we have a tax system where actually being green doesn't pay in many cases. Far better to simply carry on as usual and defer investment into the future, and kind of promise that you'll kind of turn your company around to a green machine rather than actually taking action now. And there are ways that we can use capital allowances, we can use corporation tax, we can use tax credits on an individual household basis to really stimulate that area of the economy. And that, I think the benefit of that, and I suppose another opportunity for Labour, is that, you know, often part of the scepticism the public have about grand government interventions is a concern that, you know, can these things be centrally managed? You know, if you create a huge investment pot of X billions of pounds, you know, will that actually funnel through to the ground, or will there be distortions in that process? Not that I'm against massive state intervention or expenditure in that regard, but I think the benefit of a tax relief or tax reform, if it's done properly, is it's much more decentralized and enables market participants, businesses, household individuals to kind of take action quickly, rather than waiting for something a bit slower perhaps in the system to design, say, a new relief, a new scheme, a new fund, or whatever it might be, to get things running. So I think, you know, there's an opportunity here to really turbocharge the green recovery. And I suppose the final aspect I want to talk about is, you know, and given this is a Labour business event, I'm going to focus a bit here on business and on social enterprise as well. We need to get out, I think, of this mindset that every business is equal, that, you know, all businesses are the same. The truth is, and we all know this in our own experience, there are good businesses and there are businesses perhaps which don't contribute as much to your economy and society as they could do. And what we need to do is obviously make sure our tax system is geared towards promoting and supporting those businesses that are really driving social value, really driving productivity and new investment, and give them as much support as they can to keep going, and perhaps not being as favourable on those businesses which are laggards in that regard, that aren't contributing as much to society, which are trying to shirk their responsibilities in terms of contribution to society and in terms of their employment practices, you know, whether they pay tax or not at the right rate. And I think there is an opportunity here, I think, to kind of have a proper grown-up debate in this country about what kind of business do we want in the future, and how do we recognise and reward that activity. I mean, it might surprise you to know that despite social enterprises having legal safeguards to, you know, make sure they focus on their environmental or social mission, reinvesting 50% of their profits back into the business or to deliver that social mission, there is no tax relief for social enterprises. There is a tax relief for investors in social enterprises, although I think, as Anneliese would point out, that really benefits the richest in society who've got the money to invest rather than people on the ground necessarily. But there's no support really in the system for that kind of business. And the same is true for many SMEs out there, which are doing the right thing by hiring people far away from the labour market, making productive investments and trying to grow their business in a way that's good for society and the planet, not just for their own bottom line. But yet there is very little tax support in that regard. And I think that's the kind of opportunity I think Labour has here, because I think that I can see Hamish about to cut me off, so I will finish in mid-flow, but just to say, you know, there is a real opportunity here, because I think the orthodoxy, both from the Conservatives and from the Treasury, has kind of run its course. There isn't, you know, I think the fact that we haven't seen a grand change in the tax system over the past 10 years indicates that there is a need for fresh ideas and new ideas. And I think that Labour, by focusing on its values and focusing on the social, environmental and economic impact of the work that it's doing, can reform the tax system to create change. And I suppose the figures I've mentioned earlier about the kind of £1.5 trillion out there to be diverted and changed and moved course just shows the potential, the transformational impact that tax can have if done properly. So I'll leave it to the rest of the panel to talk about their areas of expertise, but I hope that's a nice kind of warming up of the topic.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. I had no idea that just unmuting myself was such a powerful indicator that your time was up. That's quite handy to know. But no, you really covered the ground very, very well and made the fundamental point so clear that we need to look fresh at the tax system to stimulate and incentivize better behaviors across the board. And that's what brings us to our next speaker. I mean, we were particularly struck by an article she had written, which gives the title to her talk, Redesigning Tax and Economic Policy for a Fairer Recovery, which looks at a range of ways in which the tax system can result in better social outcomes, including in the green agenda, but in other areas too. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Arnold to the webinar. She's a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. I think we all know NEF and what great work they've done as a progressive think tank, helping the Labour Party, among others. So Sarah, we're very, very pleased to have you with us, and it's over to you.
Thanks for inviting me to this event. So I want to talk today about some specific examples of how taxes can be a powerful part of a government's toolkit to shape economic activity and behaviour, and combat systemic issues such as inequality and polluting behaviour that lead to environmental degradation that predate this crisis. But firstly, tax is often thought of as a tool to support public finances, and it can be, as many people have said so far. And it's clear we need significant investment in public services and public infrastructure right now. But there's two clear reasons, I think, that we shouldn't be focusing on tax revenues right now as a reason to pay for stuff that I kind of want to emphasise. Firstly, that borrowing is currently a very cheap and sensible alternative. So despite the significant uptick in UK government borrowing to tackle COVID-19 and support our recent economic hibernation, the cost of borrowing is at historic lows. And despite kind of the massive expansion of government debt recently, the cost of paying for that debt is still lower than it has been at any point since the 1950s. And it's even still roughly half of what it was during the peak of the financial crisis. So borrowing is incredibly cheap right now. And secondly, we need to be really careful about increasing taxation in the midst of the current crisis, because it could jeopardize the recovery. Enacted too quickly, taxes on income, taxes on consumption, taxes on productive investment could suppress economic activity and prolong a deep recession. And clearly the current Chancellor kind of realises this or is focusing on it. I think yesterday's mini budget, as kind of Anneliese said, was to some extent targeted at specific sectors such as hospitality and retail and reductions in VAT there, and the housing market through the reduction in stamp duty. But as she said, these were not properly targeted. And the benefits of these measures accrue to kind of the higher spending and usually the wealthier households. So the VAT cuts, if fully passed on, benefit those in the lowest quintile the least, and the biggest benefits accrue to those in the highest quintiles the most. Of course, businesses are not obliged to pass these cuts on, but this would be the effect if they were. And raising the stamp duty threshold from £125,000 to £500,000, while meant to get the housing market moving again, will mainly benefit those in London and in the southeast where housing prices are higher. So what is needed is, as we start to emerge from the immediate crisis, is to really reform the tax system to support long-term prosperity, equality and sustainability. And over the next few months and years, we need kind of a system that does two things. Firstly, that contributes to meeting rapid decarbonisation targets through penalising carbon-intensive activities. And it needs to do this while supporting a green recovery rooted in the redistribution of wealth and power. So there are several kind of failings, I guess, with the current tax system that I want to highlight, particularly about how it fails to combat high levels of inequality, and how it fails to sufficiently inhibit harmful behaviour, which leads to environmental degradation. So firstly, and I imagine Robert might talk about this a bit more, so I won't dwell on it, but I've seen it come up quite a lot in the chat, is that our system bakes in inequality, particularly between income and wealth. So wealth in general is taxed at a much lower rate than income. So just for some specific examples, the highest rate of income tax is 45%. But the highest rate of capital gains is just 20% on most assets and 28% on property. So fairly recent research by the IPPR found that equalising rates of tax on wealth and income would raise £90 billion over 5 years. So that's one way of raising tax in a kind of a relatively fair way. Another point here is that profits from assets, and particularly land as an asset, are often accrued with little effort from the owner of that wealth, and therefore its taxation wouldn't really discourage productive activity. So, for example, a land value tax is often seen as a better tax than a tax on property, because someone can increase the value of property by investing in that property, and its subsequent taxation might discourage that investment. Whereas taxing land is different. The land values accrue not as a result of the activities of the landowner really, but as a result of collective investment in that area. So we see how land values rise massively, say when train lines are extended. So now turning a bit to kind of environmental behaviours and harmful environmental behaviour in particular, our system does very little to disincentivise harmful environmental behaviour. Revenues classed as environmental have in fact declined significantly over the last few decades and fall far short of what's needed to meet decarbonisation targets set out by government. But it does get a bit complicated here because we do also need to recognise that the UK's current suite of environmental taxes to a certain extent exacerbate inequality and disproportionately impact those on lower incomes. So a really good example of that is fuel duty, which is a flat tax on petrol and therefore basically a flat tax on all motorists. And it places a significantly higher burden on the lowest income car owning households in the UK, especially since access to alternative modes of transport is very also limited in many parts of the country, particularly some of the poorest areas of the country. So some of the poorest households are forced to pay this higher burden out of necessity. So just increasing some of the environmental taxes that we currently have alone may exacerbate inequality whilst kind of decreasing the carbon impacts. And meanwhile, other polluting activities, such as international aviation, is disproportionately undertaken by a small minority of the population and is relatively undertaxed. So only 15% of people take around 70% of the flights abroad. One tax, for example, that might start to help with that progressively is a frequent flyer levy, which would be a tax which would tax progressively. The more flights you take in a year, there would be a higher rate of tax per flight. And that could replace air passenger duty, which is just a flat rate on taxes as they currently stand. So those are a couple of examples of taxes that might need reform under a system. And I think particularly the case of fuel duty really highlights the need to reform the tax system as a whole, rather than kind of focusing on one individual tax. And what we need to aim for is a tax that's progressive across the entire system, whilst also getting us to the kind of the sustainable future that we need. But recognising that individual taxes potentially may not be all progressive. And what's also needed is to happen alongside investment in the kind of low carbon infrastructure that will allow alternatives to be undertaken.
Sarah, that was terrific. Thank you so much. It's given us some real examples of the kinds of ways in which this principle of using tax as a lever can be applied, particularly to the green agenda and the economic recovery. And in light of that, we also thought that we should take a look at the wider tax reform agenda as well. As Anneliese pointed out, there hasn't been a lot of reform for a long time, and we shouldn't let this opportunity go to waste to take a root and branch look at tax reform. And so we could think of nobody better than our next speaker to talk about that. And it's Robert Palmer, head of the Tax Justice UK group. And
Thank you, Hamish. So for those of you who haven't heard of us, we are a relatively new campaign group, and our mission is all about building political momentum for progressive tax reform here in the UK. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about the context and the politics of tax right now. I fully agree with Sarah that tax rises now are a bad idea, certainly during a recession. And I think Anneliese made the same point in her budget response speech on Wednesday. But there probably are going to be tax rises in the future to support a bigger state to provide high quality services. And one of the things that I've found really interesting over the last year or so is this emerging heated split within the Conservative Party itself between the sort of Thatcherite small staters who are calling for cuts almost as soon as the pandemic is over, and a group of people who I find more interesting, who are kind of interested in more intervention and are starting to talk about what tax reform might look like. Now, traditionally for Conservatives, tax reform means cuts, but I think there are some within the Conservative Party who are starting to wake up and realise that that is not possible in the future. And so recently there was a report from a group of former Conservative advisors calling for progressive tax reform, including taxes on wealth. And last week, none other than Sajid Javid, not known for his progressive credentials, came out and suggested that the tax system should move away from taxing income to taxing wealth. So I think this is a really interesting time to be talking about tax and tax reform, and to be thinking about this in the sort of medium to long term. You know, how do we have a well-funded state that provides the sort of high quality services that we all deserve and tackle some of the problems that have been discussed by previous panelists. Now, something that often gets missed out of this conversation is, what does the public think about tax and spending? So at Tax Justice UK, we decided to find out. And over the last 6 months, we've been running a major public attitudes research project with almost a dozen focus groups and 2 big polls. We've gone around the country, particularly interested in new Conservative seats in the Red Wall, but we've heard views from all over. And some of it is unsurprising. People in general are really fed up with austerity. There's widespread support for more public spending. In fact, throughout all our focus groups, not one person proactively suggested we should be having tax cuts. So that's kind of like really interesting in terms of the political context. According to our polling, a majority are willing to pay more tax themselves, which is backed up by other research. There is definitely support for higher taxes on wealth. Sarah mentioned the idea of equalizing tax rates on income from wealth and work by raising capital gains tax. That comes out very favorably. People really understand it. It was in Labour's manifesto, so hopefully it'll be in the next one. A word of warning, people felt relatively uncomfortable if tax rises on wealth were framed in any way that was seen as attacking wealth or the rich. And that's partly because for a lot of people, wealth equals security. We live in a country where our state doesn't really look after us, or barely looks after us if we get in trouble. And so it seems only right that you build up a pot of personal wealth to look after yourself and your family. And the final thing I'll just say is that there is deep anger at poor business behavior when it comes to tax, particularly tax evasion and avoidance. The numbers on that are like off the charts. And finally, people hate inheritance tax. And that's another day's call, but I feel the left needs to do a lot more work to think about how we resuscitate that tax. So to wrap up, what does this mean for Labour? Now, I think Labour really needs to be making the argument for tax as a crucial policy tool, not just to raise revenue, but to help us build the type of society that the party wants to see. You know, as Anneliese has said, any tax changes must focus on those with the broadest shoulders. There was a bit of a tax Labour tiff earlier this week around whether Labour supported a wealth tax or not, and there was unclarity, and personally I think it was journalists getting a bit hot under the collar and excited. This might surprise you as a person from a campaign group, but I don't think now is the time for announcing lots of detailed policy. But I think what Labour should be thinking about is how to set out a bold vision for what the tax system can do, laying the groundwork. Tax change is hard, and it will take creativity and persistence to make the case for reform. In my view, I think what that means is saying, first of all, we will crack down on tax avoidance and evasion. Secondly, we will crack down on the unfair tax advantages that the wealthy currently get. And the third thing, once those two have done, is I think more of us are going to have to pay more tax in the future if we want to get the type of high quality public services we all deserve. And I think that last bit is also important. Not everyone, you know, the broadest shoulders, that's a very nice but indefined word, but I think we do need to be thinking about how we build support for what a progressive tax system looks like to support a bigger state and better quality services. So thank you.
Robert, thank you very much for putting it all in that wider context. That was extremely helpful. So we've heard from 3 experts, and you'll agree with me, that was very thought-provoking, and I'm really grateful to all of them for getting this debate underway so well. It's a lot of questions coming out through the Q&A, and I already have an arm long of questions that were submitted before. So we'll get to those shortly. But first, I did want to ask the other parliamentarian with us, who's a member of Anneliese's team, to make some comments. Our parliamentarian is Dan Carden. He was elected as the MP for Liverpool Walton in 2017, appointed Shadow International Development Secretary in 2018, and in April of this year, Keir Starmer appointed him as Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Anneliese's previous job. There's a certain symmetry here. Dan, I think you probably also had a fairly busy week, so thank you again for making time to join us tonight. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dan Carden.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Hamish. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to see friendly faces, people I've spoken to in recent weeks about where we go forward in terms of Labour tax policy. But I also want to say how important it is that we work with the business community. You know, we want good jobs to be created, we want taxes to be paid, we want to provide security for citizens across the country. And I think, you know, making sure that we keep this relationship and build it strongly over the coming months and years is really, really important. But Hamish, I'm going to be fairly brief because Anneliese is so meticulous that she has covered almost everything I would have, but perhaps I will just make a couple of points. This is now the moment that we have to look at how we rebuild our tax base post-COVID, because we don't know the long-term impacts yet. And I think everyone who takes an interest in taxation, in revenue, in how we create wealth in this country and share it, is got a really important role to play in policy development in the coming months and years. The first thing I'm doing is trying to focus on transparency and scrutiny. Anneliese mentioned tax reliefs and other issues like that. There's a lot that we don't know and that isn't actually publicly available for scrutiny in terms of tax reliefs. There's around about 111 tax reliefs are being analysed by HMRC worth upwards of 150 billion pounds lost to the Exchequer. Yet we know very little about who benefits from those, and we need to have that information made public. We need to make sure that the taxation system does tackle inequality in income and wealth, and we need to look at how we do that. And you mentioned the comments on wealth tax. Well, there are very interesting academic reports and inquiries being undertaken at this moment by the LSE, by Warwick. I know Sir Gus O'Donnell has written the foreword to one of those reports, a former cabinet secretary. So these are under discussion and under investigation at this moment, and we'll take a real interest in those, because of course we want a more equal society. That's why we're all in the Labour Party. And then finally, as many other people have mentioned, tax avoidance and tax evasion. And I think talking to a business community, there's nothing surely more frustrating and infuriating than often multinational companies that simply don't pay a fair rate of tax, whether that's through profit shifting or any other mechanism. So we need a tax system that is fair, so that those businesses that really do contribute to our society, contribute to our communities, have the best chance to make a success in that regard. Hamish, I'll leave my comments there, and I'm looking forward to hearing contributions and the rest of the call. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. You've got us back on time, so you're very the speaker that the chair loves to have. So I will be calling on you later, though, so you're not off the hook yet. So what we're going to do now is to move to the Q&A. As I say, put your question in the Q&A. Many of you have done so. I've got some written questions already, which I'll share to the extent time permits. The questions can go to an individual panelist or to the panel as a whole. not all panelists need to answer all questions, otherwise we'll not get through very many. But I think I'll start, if I may, with two related questions. And they've come both in advance and through the Q&A, and they give Anneliese, I think I'll start with you, the opportunity to be very clear about Labour's position on a wealth tax and related issues about the taxation of property. So the first question is from the Reverend David Haslam. Very simple question. Do you think a wealth tax should be instituted, and if so, in what form? And then broadening the kind of scope of the question a little bit more. Well, that also was a similar question from Andy Furlong in the Q&A. Another related question, I think, in the same sort of area of distributional issues is from Dr. Nicholas Falk. What is Labour proposing to do about property taxes? A review of the business rate system is long overdue, and council charges are quite unfair. Surely now is the time to look at the feasibility of implementing some form of land value capture, as more successful countries such as Denmark have done for years. So Anneliese, I'll invite you to comment on those questions, but also other panelists, if you want to come in, just signal to me. Anneliese.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Hamish, and thanks to the questioners for setting out those issues. I mean, I think first of all, I'd want to very strongly agree with what Sarah said, that I think we do need to be clear that right now in this period when demand is very, very weak, that actually talking about tax rises isn't necessarily where we want to be. Actually, I would say in that regard, I'm a bit concerned by some of what seems to have been put forward by the Conservatives about very quickly potentially introducing generalised tax increases, across the board, NI, income tax or VAT. I think that would choke off demand. I don't think that would be helpful. But, are there longer term issues that we need to look at around the tax system and whether it's really capturing the scope of inequality? Yes, absolutely. I think it's very, very important to do that. And, we need to draw on all of your expertise really to do that, and that of academic experts, as Dan said. I know he's been meeting, very extensively, with experts in this field. These are very, very complex issues. I find the public debate around them quite frustrating often. As I said, we obviously tried to have that debate around particularly land value at the last general election, almost immediately got hijacked into a kind of discussion about back gardens, etc., even although that was, very far away from what Labour was talking about then. But we do need to build that expertise into this so that when we create any changes, any proposals for changes at the time of the next election, that they're really well informed with expert opinion. I would say when it comes to the local taxation piece, I really strongly agree. I mean, we've ended up with a council tax system which is effectively regressive, where you've got a tiny handful of councils still providing council tax relief, some more now because of the COVID crisis, but ultimately many of them actually backing up enormous debts because of that, because they don't have enough money to deliver that, and the business rate system, which is completely dysfunctional, which in many ways actually inhibits the kinds of investment that we see and that puts businesses based on bricks at a disadvantage compared with those based on clicks. We do need to have a reform of this. I think it should be looking at distributional issues, but it should also be looking at the need for local government to have a sustainable revenue stream as well. Actually, we're seeing it going in the wrong direction over this, definitely in the wrong direction. We need to have that sensible conversation. So again, ideas around this, we're really, really keen to hear them from all of you over the next few years as we develop those plans.
Thank you, Anneliese. Sarah, you were raising your hand on this one.
Yeah, just really specifically on the point of kind of local taxation and reform of business rates in particular. It was interesting that one of the questioners mentioned Denmark, because I think the Danish system is very sensible in that it takes the property tax system as we have, but it splits it explicitly into a land element and a property element and has different rates of taxation on both. And that's one area that we've certainly been looking into or trying to think about as a potential solution for local government, whereby you could have a split rate of taxation where property taxes are retained locally to give kind of a stream of local revenue, and land value could be redistributed across the country, which would allow a system that might be potentially much more equitable between places, but also gives local government a lever to incentivize businesses to invest or not invest, depending on their local areas, through controlling the property tax element. So you wanted to drop that in as an idea.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll move on. Andrew, did you want to come in on that one? Yeah, by all means.
Very quick point. I mean, I think there is general agreement. I think that we need to move towards land value tax. I just think it's the political difficulties of how we manage that process. So I'm afraid, Anneliese and Dan, it's one for your kind of box, as it were, of how to do that. But I think in terms of the business element of it, I think what's really come home from the COVID-19 crisis is just how inflexible the tax system is. I mean, we are in the middle, even before COVID-19, of a health crisis, an obesity crisis. And yet, you know, if you walk down any high street, you will see about 7 or 8 chicken shops and takeaways and, you know, very fatty, unhealthy food shops out there that are receiving quite generous amounts of tax support. And yet healthier alternatives probably are not receiving that element of tax support. And I think it's just, again, it's not to punish those businesses by saying they should pay more tax necessarily, but if there is going to be a tax relief out there, how do we target those as the kind of lifestyle choices we want people to make, incentivizing those, encouraging the kind of businesses we want to see. I think Anneliese is right about the kind of bricks versus clicks. We want to make sure there's parity between those, but we also want to make sure even within the bricks, it's the right kind of bricks. And I think one of the things that people have noticed with their high streets is that they're not getting the kind of business environment they want locally. And people, again, the tax system is kind of encouraging that by providing such heavy discounts to particular types of small businesses. So I think even within that, focusing on social value and social and environmental impact, which we can do, is a real opportunity, I think, to make sure that we get the kind of right business environment in a local area.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'll move on, and I will come back to you, Robert, later, don't worry. There's a question I think that's been pretty much covered, but I just wanted to give it an acknowledgement from a Labour business member from Cornwall, to whom I referred earlier, who's found it easier to join this webinar than to come to a meeting in London, I think, Gareth Looker. But he made the point that the COVID crisis has highlighted how retail is changing. And he wants to know how Labour will ensure a level playing field in terms of business rates and corporation tax. For example, the superstores only paying rates assessed on the shop front compared with the small glass entrance atrium, and Amazon paying minimal. So I think probably that you've covered that, Anneliese, but if you wanted to come back on that, by all means. But there's a related question that I wanted to link to it, and that is about control over business taxation. This is from Liz Hind, another Labour business member and a chair of our Women in Business Policy Group. She says, should control over business taxation, like a reformed business rates system, be handed to local government to allow them more flexibility to control the types of businesses they support? So either Anneliese or Dan might want to come in on that one first. Either of you?
I don't mind. Would I kick off, and then Dan, if you want to come in?
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
I mean, I'd want to thank Liz. Actually, I think she's been doing brilliant campaigning for SMEs and for the pub sector during this crisis. So big thanks for that, Liz. I mean, I think this is a challenging area actually, because we need to make sure there's enough flexibility locally, but at the same time, we shouldn't end up in a situation where local authorities are being told, oh, isn't it great, you've got freedom to do what you want with your business rates, but actually many of them can't garner enough revenue from business rates and from council tax to then cover their costs. And of course, we've had that localization of business rates, you know, pooling across some local authorities, but we haven't seen a proper mechanism then for smoothing out the inequalities in that system. So, you know, you potentially got quite a lot of local authorities that have got a very, very weak capacity to be raising funds. You know, the kind of ideology behind this has always been that, oh, well, you know, local authorities will work harder to encourage businesses to base themselves in that area. Well, that surely only goes so far. You know, it'll often be the rich, much richer areas which will be much better able to do that compared to the poorer areas. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, yes, let's ensure that there is flexibility where it's possible, but let's not end up in a situation like we are currently, where the ability to sometimes, in some cases, to actually particularly be able to to gather council tax, but also business rates as well, with that more localized system, that could then lead to a reduction in local services, where there isn't that kind of smoothing mechanism in the UK that exists in more federal systems, for example. But I don't know, Dan, if you'd want to add anything to that.
I would just say, as a Liverpool MP, I've seen, some of the detriments of this. And so whilst, of course, so much can be done through devolution and through empowering local authorities, I think we have to make sure that the answers we come up with are ones that tackle inequality and poverty across the country. And that has to be a key focus of tax policy change.
Thank you, Dan. Anyone else on the panel want to comment? No? Okay.
Sorry.
Andrew, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Just very, very quickly. I mean, I just think that I think Anneliese is absolutely right about the business rates reforms the government's put through. It really is encouraging a race to the bottom in terms of tax revenue raising. And I think that is a concern. And I think I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to devolution of tax in that kind of manner, just because I think capital is incredibly mobile and it does encourage, it puts pressure on political authorities at a local or regional level to kind of end up in competition with each other to attract that flow of capital. So I think I'm very much supportive of the idea that there should be more discretion given to local authorities about some of the implementation of some of those tax reliefs. I mentioned there with business rates earlier, but I think the idea that we should be having these kind of hyper-local tax systems, I think that might be a bit of an inconsistency. And I also think from a business environment, a lot of our members, and I'm sure many can kind of contribute in the comments here as well, the inconsistencies are really difficult to manage in terms of business planning as well. If you're operating across multiple locations within a region, you've got different levels of taxation, certain people charging certain rates, others not doing so. It can become quite difficult to practically manage. So that's not necessarily to say it shouldn't happen, but I think there are risks with that. I think the key we should be sorting out at the moment is just the general principles underlying the tax system, making sure that it is pro-social, pro-environmental. And then I think once you've got that in place, then we can potentially experiment. But I think we are kind of running before we can walk, because I think, as we've all agreed on this panel, the national tax system isn't even working effectively. So, let's sort that out first before we start deciding about whether, we should have a local wealth tax or a local business rate tax or a local land value tax. Let's get the whole system focused properly.
Thank you, Andrew. Can I put that same question to Robert? Does Tax Justice UK have any view about the appropriate level at which, a level of government at which these various taxes should be decided?
I mean, I think it's difficult because we have one of the most, we have a fairly centralized government and country, particularly in England, with lots of powers retained in Westminster, including revenue raising powers. I mean, I think if you're going to, as Anneliese mentioned, if you're going to devolve revenue raising powers and spending powers, you need to make sure there's some mechanism to make sure that you're smoothing out between different authorities. I mean, I think sometimes devolution can be really beneficial, but there are other ways in which it can be used as part of a sort of race to the bottom agenda. And I'm thinking of, for example, this government is committed to introducing free ports. Now, my personal view is I think they're going to end up being glorified industrial parks at the edge of marginal seats the Conservatives want to win in the North and the Midlands, but they have said that they might include some fairly drastic sort of tax and regulatory cuts. There's also been the option that the Northern Ireland Assembly could reduce corporation tax to 12.5% to match that in the Republic of Ireland. So I think there is also a danger around if you devolve tax raising powers in the wrong way, you can set up a system where you're just encouraging local authorities to slash and burn, and I don't think that's what we want. I mean, the original question was about how you use the tax system to encourage sort of good and bad business, and I think there's definitely some things that the tax system can do, but I think tax can be quite a blunt tool, and I think there's a whole range of other tools that government has at its disposal to encourage behaviour that it wants.
Thank you, Robert. That brings us neatly on to the next question. You've obviously been reading my notes. We're going to move now towards the debate around how do you incentivize better behavior, particularly of interest to Labour business members is better business behavior. I think somebody said earlier, there's nothing more annoys a person in business than a playing field that isn't level, where people get away with blue murder. And I've got a number of questions that focus more now on the incentivization piece. I'd like to take one first from Jeffrey Kingscott, He won't mind me saying he's a QC, but we won't hold that against him. He says economic recovery depends to an extent on consumption of products and services. It must be better for the economy for consumers to do business with companies that pay full domestic tax, including corporation tax, rather than companies that minimize or avoid UK tax. What is the best way for individuals and companies to make informed decisions about the tax status of companies from whom they purchase goods and services? And he wonders if some sort of kite mark system might be considered. And I'll give him a second question because it's related. How can we best achieve a level playing field between ethical tax-paying companies and corporations and non-tax-paying companies? And of course, it's a really important agenda for Labour business, because in Labour, we're very, very good at pointing at bad businesses. We're not so good at defining what a good business means. So one of our policy groups is working very, very hard on that. And I must say, we haven't yet focused on the idea that the tax system may be a way of incentivizing better business behavior, but that's certainly going to be on our agenda going forward. But of course, there are other aspects of company law change, a stakeholder approach to corporate governance that we're looking at as well. So I'd really welcome thoughts on those two questions and anything related to the broader topic of how do we encourage better business practices. So Robert's signaling first, so why don't you go in next?
Very quickly. There is actually already a kite mark for good tax behaviour. It's called the Fair Tax Mark, and a lot of cooperatives and SMEs and social enterprises have got the kite mark, but as well as some much larger businesses. So it is possible, and that's actually part of the tax justice agenda and strategy, that we both want to call out bad behaviour, but also do the work to celebrate good tax behaviour. I mean, I think sometimes this debate around tax avoidance and evasion does get focused on individual companies, and individual companies do have agency in how they set themselves up and the decisions they make. But ultimately, I come back to, they operate in a system that allows them to do this. And so ultimately the reforms that we'd like to see are reforms to the system that makes it harder for your Googles and your Amazons to pay very, very little tax, which undermines the business model of well-behaved companies. So there's a kite mark, fair tax mark, plug it again, but also I think we really need to be thinking about systemic change.
Another question that came up in the Q&A that I'll throw in as well is the concept of conditionality in taxation, whether some sort of tax benefit or disbenefit or other governmental benefits and disbenefits could be dependent upon good corporate behavior. An obvious example of that in the field that I know as a procurement lawyer is government contracting, where certainly there should be stricter enforcement of existing rules that say that, if you've misperformed a previous government contract, you shouldn't be on the shortlist for the next one. So, but I wonder from a tax point of view, whether that concept of conditionality is something that any of you want to comment on. Either Robert or anyone else on the panel? Robert, yeah, you go ahead.
Incredibly briefly, it's quite difficult under EU procurement rules, and the Fair Tax Mark again have done quite a lot of work on this. So it's something that they've been trying to do, but under existing EU rules, it is difficult. We are, of course, leaving the EU. That potentially leaves some options to think about procurement and think about procurement conditionality.
Yes, Anneliese, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, this has been quite a big discussion, I think, within the tax justice movement. I think it might even be one that I've talked to Robert about before as well. I mean, government actually currently in the UK includes within its procurement system some requirements around tax behaviour. So, in theory, there is a procurement notice that's meant to outlaw procurement. Well, certainly different departments are meant to indicate that they've gone through a process. Unsurprisingly, when I've asked parliamentary questions about this, it appears that there's no record keeping on any of this. I'd be pretty astonished if it's being done properly. So clearly, that's something that we'll keep pushing on. But I would just say as well now, that issue of conditionality, we have been saying to government, it should be following other governments, we see, I think Denmark, some other countries, in fact, Dan probably knows more about this than I do, but where they have imposed conditions for bailouts, for example, they said that that companies shouldn't be using tax havens. I saw that came up in the Q&A. They shouldn't be, engaging in nefarious tax activity in order to be able to access public funds. It does seem to be very sensible that should be applied now, because ultimately this would be public support for those companies.
Yeah, thank you, Anneliese.
Sorry.
I've got very little time left, so very quick one from you, Andrew, and then I'm going to take just a couple final questions.
Just a couple of quick points, really. I think the first, just to commit a bit of a heresy, I'm not a fan of the level playing field. I think equality, when it comes to kind of business, is part of the mess we get into. I'm more of a fan of equity in that space. I think there are certain businesses and certain types of geographies and characteristics which we should be promoting because we know they do better. And I think treating everybody the same actually just encourages kind of no change, really. So actually, I think there is an argument for kind of maybe tipping the playing field slightly more towards those that have a kind of pro-social, pro-environmental and strong social impact. And I think the second point on conditionality, and you've mentioned, I sort of, to plug the Fair Tax Mark, I'll also plug the Social Value Act as well as an opportunity there. And I know that Labour has done a lot of work on looking at procurement. I know, Hamish, you read a paper for Ed Miliband's team as well on kind of pro-social procurement. There's huge potential there. I think what I think we should be doing, though, as a minimum, is not saying that paying your taxes should be seen as a kind of a social benefit. I think that's the bare legal minimum that people should be doing. We should be adding on top of that. But absolutely, we should be using procurement as a tool to shape markets, and social enterprises have seen, I think, at first hand that where that's done well and the right criteria and characteristics are put in there, you can have a transformational impact. To give an example, up in Manchester, I know that Tameside Council and Stockport Council and a few others who have a procurement network there, they've managed to generate 28% social value return on the contracts they've got there. So effectively, they're getting almost a third back in value from apprenticeships, job opportunities, low carbon kind of equipment being installed, all that kind of stuff, community volunteering, all that community benefit we want to see. So there's huge potential in the procurement side. If you align that with tax as well, you've got real powerful levers there.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Andrew. Now, just some warning to the panelists. There's a final question I'm going to put to you, and I'll give you a few minutes to think about it while I ask another question. The final question that's been put to us is, will each panelist please tell us whether they have one specific tax reform that they'd like to share with us tonight or not. And I'll ask that at the very end. Before we get to that, while you're thinking and scratching your heads, I have to apologize. We haven't been able to get into international global tax issues. It's a huge agenda, and I just have to say we didn't have the time for the global dimension, but clearly that's important. And in the domestic context, I'll just raise one question that's been put to us, which is about, by a number of people in different forms, what the panel thinks about any kind of digital services or digital taxation on the likes of the Amazons and the Facebooks and the others. So from a domestic perspective, does anyone want to just give me a shortish answer on that, 2 or 3 of you, and then we'll take the last question about your favorite tax reform. So digital taxation, digital services. Yes, Robert.
Just very briefly, we've got an international tax system that was designed 100 years ago, and it doesn't work for our current economy. And so it means that these big digital giants can get away with paying very little tax. Digital services tax, bit of a crude tool, but it's really good at putting pressure to try and get international compromise to fix our broken international tax system. So yes, bit crude, but an important way of putting pressure on these companies.
Thank you, Robert. Anyone else want to pick that one up? Is there sort of nodding agreement with that, or is that unfair to assume silence, as I said? No, I think there's a bit of a nodding agreement that needs to be addressed. Okay, thanks, Robert. So I will now ask each of you to nominate one specific tax reform that you'd like to see a Labour government introduce. I'll start with Sarah, and I'll go around the panel.
So I feel like I've said this several times now, but I'm just going to say
That's okay.
it again. I would be really interested to see reform of local property taxation to take into account also a land value tax as well, and to think about how that together they could be used as a tool to both redistribute income across the country, but at the same time give local government more control over local taxes by splitting out the property and land elements.
Very good, thank you. Robert, you're next.
I think there's a real danger in the next decade or two, a Tory government is going to get rid of inheritance tax if it's not reformed properly. I don't necessarily have the answers of what that looks like, but when you've got a tax that 70% of the public don't like, you've got a problem. It's also one of our fairest taxes. So finding a way to reform inheritance tax in a way that the public will actually buy. Tall order, but.
All right, there's a modest agenda for you. Okay, Andrew, you're next.
It's like you're asking me to pick between my children, Hamish.
One, that was the question.
One. I mean, I think
I'm
not going to say something specific, but I just think in terms of, I think some kind of tax, whether it's business rate relief or corporation tax, seem to recognise the huge value that cooperative businesses, mutual businesses, social enterprises are making in the tax system. I think there's an opportunity to send a real powerful marker to the economy about the type of businesses that Labour wants to see. I think it would definitely boost their competitiveness and help them to compete in the marketplace. And I think they have real positive social and environmental impacts elsewhere. So whatever wonderful system that Labour come up with to redesign the tax system, I think whether that's corporation tax, business rates or whatever, to insert that kind of principle around backing social businesses would be great.
Okay, that's good. Now I'm going to call on the financial secretary, shadow though he is, if he wants to name a preferred tax reform.
Yeah, well, I absolutely endorse Andrew's call there, because I have such good cooperatives and social, positively social businesses in Liverpool Walton, and I want to see the tax system support them. I'm going to say I think we need a Labour Party and a Labour government that is going to be confident to lead the international debate on reforming international taxes, because it is an outrage that enormous multinational corporations don't pay their fair share. I think it angers the public. I think it needs to be dealt with. It probably won't be whilst Donald Trump's in the White House, but let's see where we are come 2024. But I think the Labour Party should be confident to lead that debate and push for it.
Thank you, Dan. And I think last word to you, Anneliese.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I strongly agree with everything that Dan said, and I should say there are never any tiffs in the Labour Party. They're just purely created by journalists. Actually, genuinely, in that case that Robert referred to, absolute nonsense. But I would say that apart from agreeing with Dan on everything, I think actually that point about transparency is something that's really got to change, because I think if we could see exactly where, particularly tax reliefs were going, but also if we had proper distributional analysis of existing taxes at the time of budgets, which we do not have, which we can't see properly, then I think that would actually build a lot of pressure from the grassroots up, as well as Labour having to do that itself as a political party. But big thanks also to everyone who's taken part in this. It's been a great discussion.
Well, thank you, Anneliese. This is where, the chair would call for a round of applause and we'd be deafened. And people would be hanging from the rafters to say what a great job you all did. So thank you for that. And my apology as chair that I couldn't call more than a tiny fraction of those questions that were put to us. But I hope you all benefited from the discussion. I certainly did. And I want to hand over last but not least to my colleague Liz Minns, who is the vice chair, as I said, of our economic policy group, to round off the proceedings. Liz.
Sorry. Thank you, Hamish. First, can I just say on behalf of Labour Business and Social Enterprise UK, a huge thanks to Anneliese, Dan, and our panelists, Sarah, Robert, and Andrew. We do know that for the past 3 months, Anneliese's feet have barely touched the ground. And so we were particularly delighted to have you with us tonight, Anneliese. Thank you also to everyone who's joined us this evening to hear the conversation. Some really very important and relevant contributions have come through in the Q&As, and we'll be picking all of those up as we move forward with what's come from this conversation. I'm sure many of us listening to Anneliese's and Dan's thoughts in particular, and the insightful and visionary contributions of the panelists, will feel that we have glimpsed just fleetingly how a government committed to implementing a fairer taxation regime for a fairer and more sustainable economy might operate, and the paradigm shifts we would see in our country as a result of that. Both Social Enterprise UK and Labour Business are committed to ensuring good business, complemented by fairer taxation, so that it plays its vitally important role in creating a more equal society, a fairer world, and in protecting our planet. Do please stay in touch through our website and join us on the economics policy group that Hamish chairs and I'm vice of within Labour Business, if you would like to play a more active role in providing whatever support we can here, Anneliese and Dan, and the Labour Party more widely, in ensuring that good business and fairer taxation are leading the way. And that's it, folks. Once again, many thanks. And for the moment anyway, goodbye.